This is the second in my series of interviews with authors of a new book, Transgender Children and Young Adults. It's a very important book, and I am fortunate to have two of the authors, Robert Withers and Miranda Yardley. And if I could just ask each of you, please, to introduce yourselves, say what you do, and why you contributed your own chapters. If we can start with Robert, please.
Hi. Yes, I'm Robert Withers, and I work as an analyst. I'm technically a Jungian analyst, but I've also been trained in other psychoanalytic schools, so I don't consider myself particularly Jungian, Freudian, Kleinian, Lacanian, but use all of those people. In my chapter, I've used Donald Winnicott quite a lot, who's an object relations theorist, and I suppose my angle is to try and think about unconscious processes that may be at work in the origins of transgender phenomena, and therefore what that opens up in terms of the potential to work psychotherapeutically with people in a way that avoids the necessity for surgery and hormones. And with children, I think that's particularly important because, of course, they're not fully formed adults. And so I think it's particularly important not to close down the possibility of working psychotherapeutically with them.
And Miranda?
Hi, I'm Miranda Yardley. I'm an accountant, and I wrote a chapter that is called A Life Uninterrupted by Transition, which looks at the vectors that are affecting transition of children, young adults, and also adults, and in particular looks at the influence of adults who have transitioned upon the current culture, transgender culture. In particular, it looks at the way that the histories of the young children, the lives of the young children, are being appropriated by older transgender activists, and contextualizes that with what we know about the etiology of transgenderism.
Okay, and when it comes to the etiology, here's where the big controversy seems to exist, at least among certain people. And you mentioned this in your chapter, and I'll ask you, Miranda.
First of all, what I would say is that this idea predates Blanchard's work by some time. Marcus Hirschfeld wrote about the erotic components and looked at ways of classifying different types of cross-dresser or transvestites in 1918. Essentially, what Blanchard taxonomy does is it tidies the thinking and the way that the types of transgender male are recognized by separating them into two types. One is the homosexual transsexual and one is the non-homosexual transsexual. And the etiology of their different types of transsexual are markedly different.
Okay. And with regard to those two different pathways, Robert, did you want to maybe discuss whether that is relevant to your chapter where you described taking different approaches and showing how psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approaches to understanding the mind and why people might feel trans, that different history or different ideology affect the way you would approach treatment?
Well, I'd like to add that Blanchard has just added this rapid onset gender dysphoria, of course, now, which is trying to take into account the fact that there's a huge number of young, particularly women, who wish to transition into being male. And he sees that as a kind of third kind, which needs understanding very differently. And I think there may be some benefit in thinking about that. My practice is as a general analyst, I just see people, some of whom happen to be transgender, some of whom happen to be young adults, some of whom are maybe rapid onset gender dysphoria. And Blanchard's taxonomy doesn't particularly inform the way that I work. I just work with what I find. But I must say what I found doesn't contradict his taxonomy.
Now, just to go into a bit more detail, and I'll ask you, Miranda, I think that we get the most resistance to this dichotomy. And again, the rapid onset gender dysphoria we'll talk about afterwards. But when we go to the male to female distinction of the homosexual versus heterosexual transsexuals, we get most of the blowback from autogynephiles, and they find that this is fetishizing their experience or their lives. Your experience might be different as far as seeing the type of reaction to this system.
I think that if we talking openly about it as being a fetish or a perversion, I don't really think is a very constructive way of doing it, because what it does is it shuts the conversation down. You know, who would want to talk about such a large part of their core identity as being a fetish or a perversion? You know, what that does is it immediately it's invalidating how someone sees themselves. Now, one thing that I think is important is that we look upon the predicament that people find themselves in a compassionate way. And I think a great way to do this is to look upon the way that this works in the way that Anne Lawrence contextualized it in the essay that Lawrence wrote called Becoming What We Love, where the way that the identity of the autogynephilic male to female transsexual develops, it's more like a long-term romantic love affair with the self. And I think that that is quite an insightful way of explaining and showing how that type of transsexual identity evolves. I think as well it's quite a compassionate way of looking at it, because it is in essence the long-term romance that the autogynephile has. And certainly the people that I've talked to about this and I've introduced the essay to have read Becoming What We Love, and they've gone, wow, this is amazing. I never thought I'd find anybody that would understand me the way that this does. I think that the thinking that Lawrence used in that and the way that Lawrence has contextualized that form of transsexualism is very inspired. I think also it shows very clearly the way that the autogynephilic sexual orientation competes with heterosexuality, and it can be contextualized as being a form of heterosexuality.
Okay. Now, you discuss in the book different theories, and you talk about the feminine essence theory, and you also talk about this romantic love theory, and you're saying like loving the self. Can you explain why you think, maybe describe the feminine essence theory and why you agree or disagree with that as an explanation?
Blanchard wrote a great critique of the feminine essence theory that shows the weakness with the idea that I believe that what it says is it presupposes that there's only one type of essence the transsexual can have, and clearly it's contradicted with any particular way in which you look at it. I think as well that looking upon the idea of it being a feminine essence, feminine itself is related in language to gender stereotypes or sex-based stereotypes associated with females, so that you're not born with any cultural understanding of what it means to be feminine. If it means that the person has got a predisposition to what we culturally interpret as female sex-based stereotypes, then it means something other than, that you've got the essence of a female living inside you. Also, as someone who studied the work of Sartre and de Beauvoir and others when I was an undergraduate, and still reference quite a lot of work by the existentialist school, I think that sort of thinking of having some sort of biological essence or some sort of essence that we're born with that makes us into that kind of thing, I think it's a regressive type of thinking. It doesn't really sit well with the way that I view the world myself.
I'd agree with that, but I'd also, getting back to your original question, the very first person that I ever saw was a male to female wanting to detransition to be a man again. This was about 25 years ago. And he was autogynephilic, but it didn't form the main part of his critique of being transsexual. He felt very strongly that he'd been sold a surgical solution to a psychological problem, and that there was an industry and a culture which was leading him to a false solution for what he could see in retrospect were a series of issues to do with the failure to identify with masculinity because of a particularly violent and abusive father, and a mother who he felt would only love him if he identified as female. And he felt that if he'd had a psychoanalytic kind of therapy before the surgery, and if he'd actually believed that it was possible for that to help, he probably wouldn't have transitioned.
You write in your chapter about trying to work with people from a psychoanalytic or any type of psychological perspective to try to understand what other forces, either internal or external, might make somebody, as you say, kind of have a dissociation between the mind and the body. That's kind of the core of the chapter. Can you elaborate on that, this dissociation?
It follows on from what Miranda was saying about this idea of an essence or a feminine essence. And the question I'd ask philosophically is how one knows that one's core essence is male or female. And I think the only way that one can know that is through some sort of process of introspection. It's not open to validation. It's not open to observation. It may be very important, it may give meaning to life, but that's not the same as something to do with biology or the body, which can kind of be measured and confirmed in external reality and tested. So I think I've conceptualized the person who suffers from gender dysphoria. It can be conceptualized as a mismatch between their subjective sense of who they are, which is their mind, and their biological body. And so you can think of the idea that the person has identified exclusively with the mind while dissociating from their body for various reasons. And several of the cases in the chapter indicate how that might happen. For instance, if a person is traumatized, they may temporarily dissociate from the body as a way of protecting themselves from trauma. But if that becomes a kind of established way of being, fairly soon, there's a more permanent dissociation from the body. And as Winnicott would put it, the psyche kind of sets up home in the mind. And then there's an identification with a disembodied mind and a dissociation from a body, which contains the trauma or the experience which the person has dissociated from. So to get back in touch with the body involves facing the feelings which caused the dissociation in the first place. So it's very, very uncomfortable. But at the same time, if you can get yourself back into an intimate connection between the mind and the body, then you have a kind of sense of feeling at home in your own body. And at the end of that, you wouldn't have that dysphoria. So there would be a way of trying to help the person face the trauma, the feelings associated with the trauma, and through that, become more at home in their own body. And that would be the kind of psychoanalytic route which is charted out by Winnicott originally, and then other people like Thomas Ogden, who are more contemporary followers of Winnicott in a way. So that's the kind of approach that I would hope could be used in the work with people who are gender dysphoric. And in fact, Winnicott does do that with a patient at a time before it became popular to be transgender. The problem with doing it in this culture is that if you try to do it, the person accuses you of transphobia and just says, well, you don't really understand my condition. I was born in my body as a woman, and actually I may be biologically a man, but my essence is that I'm a woman. And if you don't realize that, you're either completely ignorant or transphobic. And so there's a kind of cultural pressure to move towards the medical solution, which particularly for young people is not necessarily such a good idea because it's irreversible, involves sterilization and lifelong medical treatment on hormones. So that's basically where I'm kind of coming from with this chapter.
Okay. And Miranda, so when you hear Robert conceptualizing it that way, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's fair enough. I think the observations are valid. I don't think that anything that Robert says is incompatible with the ideas that Lawrence talks about or the way that Blanchard explains the taxonomy or Bailey has popularized it. I do take objection to the way that this born in the wrong body narrative is being thrown around. It was kind of something that became a very popular way that patients would explain about themselves some years ago, and it seems to have become part of some standard narrative. I don't think that we can know what it's like to be born in a body that belongs to the opposite sex, I don't think that we can ascribe any meaning to someone who is male saying, oh, I feel like I'm female, or I feel like someone else. Rebecca Riley Cooper has said it's an equivalent of Wittgenstein's beetle in the box, or think about Nagel's essay, How Does It Feel to Be a Bat? Also, there is a real conceptual problem in that if people were coming to it and saying, yes, my mind and body are mismatched, then they would have to be born with some innate idea about what the word woman means that would have to be flashing up there in their head. It makes no sense to me. I don't think we can ascribe an etiology based upon this essence like that, because it presupposes so much prior knowledge that it sounds utterly absurd. It's got a very, very weak philosophical underpinning, and also, as Bob pointed out, with the work that's been done looking at transgender brains, I don't think there is really any work that has been done that would substantiate that type of brain structure that could arise with anybody feasibly having a brain and body mismatch. In particular, what I understand is that the Cantor's interpretation of recent work is that what brain scans seem to do is that they differentiate based upon sexual orientation, which I think is quite important and something that is being overlooked.
Yeah, well, and of course it's a later development of sexual orientation, isn't it? Whereas the argument you're talking about seems to suggest that people are born in the wrong body, a pink brain in a blue body, and so on. And for that, there isn't any scientific evidence, but there is a lot of mythology put about there. And on the basis of that, again, people tend to think things like psychotherapy are not going to work because they've been told that science says that this is something that happened to them in the womb. And at the moment, there's no actual scientific evidence for that. It's just the feeling, which, from my perspective, might be coming from any number of different sources, some of which might just be the unconscious, because obviously we're not conscious of the unconscious, but we might find ourselves feeling female for reasons that we're unconscious of, and then we might misinterpret that as the feeling that we've been born in the wrong body.